The USS Abraham Lincoln cut through the Pacific waters like a blade through silk, its massive nuclear-powered hull displacing thousands of tons of ocean as it made its way back to Naval Base Kitsap. Seaman recruit Tyler Jennings stood on the hangar deck, his crisp new uniform still stiff with that fresh-from-the-package feel, watching the other sailors move around him with the practiced efficiency of people who actually knew what they were doing. He'd been on the carrier for exactly 72 hours, and in that time he'd managed to convince himself that he understood the Navy better than most of the veterans who'd been sailing these waters for decades. The confidence wasn't entirely unwarranted, because Tyler had grown up with technology, with screens and GPS and apps that could tell you anything you needed to know with a single tap, and in his mind that made him more capable than any old salt who still relied on outdated methods. He watched as the deck crew secured aircraft with chains and chocks, their movements choreographed through years of repetition, and he felt a surge of superiority because he knew that all of this could be optimized, streamlined, made more efficient with the right technology. What he didn't notice, what he couldn't have noticed in his bubble of youthful arrogance, was the man pushing a mop bucket across the deck about 30 feet behind him. The man was old, maybe 65, with silver hair that caught the fading sunlight and hands that were weathered from decades of work. His blue coveralls were faded and stained, marked with the kind of wear that comes from years of honest labor, and he moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who'd learned long ago that rushing got you nowhere on a ship. His name was Walter Hayes, though nobody called him that anymore, and if Tyler had bothered to look at the name tape on his coveralls, he would have seen just Hayes stitched in faded black thread. The other sailors gave Hayes a respectful nod as they passed, a small gesture that Tyler interpreted as pity for an old man relegated to janitorial duty, when in reality it was something closer to reverence. Hayes had been Navy, real Navy, back when navigation meant celestial sighting and dead reckoning, when a mistake with a sextant could put your ship hundreds of miles off course or worse, run you into rocks that could tear through a hull like paper. He'd left active duty 20 years ago but couldn't quite leave the sea, so he'd taken a civilian contractor position doing maintenance work on the Lincoln, content to spend his remaining years among the sounds and smells that had defined his life. The mess hall buzzed with the usual evening chaos, trays clattering and voices rising in competition with each other as sailors decompressed from their shifts. Tyler sat with his group, the other new recruits who'd arrived on the Lincoln around the same time, all of them still wearing their confidence like armor against the vast unknown that was carrier life. They were talking about the exercises they'd be running over the next few weeks, simulated combat scenarios that would test the crew's readiness, and Tyler was holding court about how modern GPS systems had made navigation essentially foolproof. He gestured with his fork, explaining how satellite positioning had removed all the guesswork, how you could track a vessel's location down to within a few meters anywhere on the planet, how the old ways of doing things were basically museum pieces at this point. That's when someone noticed Hayes sitting alone at a corner table, his tray mostly untouched, and beside him on the bench was an old leather satchel that looked like it had survived a war or two. One of Tyler's buddies, a kid named Morrison from Ohio, squinted at the satchel and then nudged Tyler. "Check out Grandpa's bag," Morrison said, keeping his voice low but not quite low enough. Hayes didn't react, just continued eating his meal with the same deliberate slowness he brought to everything, but Tyler's curiosity was piqued. He stood up, his confidence emboldened by the audience of his peers, and walked over to Hayes's table with the kind of swagger that only the truly ignorant can manage. "Hey, Pops," Tyler said, his tone friendly enough but laced with condescension. "What's in the antique shop you're carrying around?" Hayes looked up slowly, his eyes a pale blue that seemed to see more than they should, and for a moment Tyler felt something shift in his chest, some instinctive warning that he was stepping into territory he didn't understand. But the feeling passed quickly, overwhelmed by the need to perform for his friends who were now openly watching the interaction. Hayes didn't answer immediately, just reached into the satchel and pulled out a brass sextant, its surface tarnished but still bearing the marks of meticulous care. He set it on the table between them, followed by a pair of dividers, a parallel ruler, and a worn notebook filled with mathematical tables and handwritten notes. "Navigation tools," Hayes said simply, his voice carrying the gravel of a lifetime of shouted orders over engine noise and wind. Tyler stared at the instruments for a moment, then let out a laugh that was genuine in its disbelief. "You're kidding, right? You actually use these things?" The question hung in the air, and suddenly Morrison and the others were there too, crowding around to look at what they perceived as relics from a bygone era. "This is like finding someone who still uses a rotary phone," Morrison added, picking up the dividers and examining them like they were curiosities from an archaeological dig. Hayes watched the young men handle his tools with a mixture of amusement and something darker, a knowledge that they were playing with concepts they couldn't begin to comprehend. He'd seen this before, this arrogance of youth backed by technology, and he knew how it ended because he'd lived through the transition himself. There was a time when he'd been just as confident, just as certain that the new ways were better, but the sea had taught him humility in the way that only the sea can, through near misses and actual disasters that left him understanding the fragility of human systems. "These tools don't need batteries," Hayes said, his voice cutting through their laughter. "They don't need satellites or signals or any of that. They work when everything else fails." Tyler exchanged a glance with Morrison, both of them trying to suppress grins. "Yeah, but when's the last time everything failed? We've got redundant systems, backup power, satellite networks that are maintained by entire teams of engineers. This stuff," he gestured at the sextant, "is like keeping a horse in your garage in case your car breaks down." The comparison drew more laughs from the gathered sailors, and Hayes felt the familiar weight of trying to teach people who weren't ready to learn. He'd been a navigation instructor once back at the Naval Academy, and he remembered the eager faces of midshipmen who actually wanted to understand the principles behind the technology they'd be using. These kids were different, raised in an era where everything just worked until it didn't, where failure was an abstraction rather than a lived reality. "The ocean doesn't care about your technology," Hayes said, and there was an edge to his voice now, a hint of the authority he'd once wielded as a commanding officer. "It doesn't care about your redundant systems or your satellite networks. When you're out there and something goes wrong, and I mean really wrong, these tools are what will bring you home." Tyler felt a flicker of irritation at the old man's tone, at the implication that he and his generation were somehow less capable because they'd been born into an age of advancement. "Look, I respect that you learned all this stuff back in the day," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing quality that made Hayes's jaw tighten, "but we've moved past it. We don't need to know how to navigate by stars, any more than we need to know how to send messages by carrier pigeon." The other sailors nodded in agreement, their faith in modern systems absolute and unshakable, and Hayes realized that nothing he could say would penetrate that certainty, so he simply gathered his tools, placing them back in the leather satchel with careful precision, and stood up from the table. 3 days later, the Lincoln was running exercises 200 miles off the coast of Washington, part of a larger training operation that involved multiple vessels and aircraft conducting simulated warfare scenarios. The weather had been clear when they'd started, perfect conditions for the complex maneuvers they were practicing, but by late afternoon the sky had begun to change in ways that made the veteran sailors uneasy. Dark clouds massed on the western horizon like an invading army, their edges lit from within by flickers of lightning that were still too far away to hear. The meteorological reports had predicted rough weather, but nothing serious, a standard Pacific storm system that would bring some rain and moderate seas before passing through. What the reports hadn't predicted, what nobody could have predicted, was the solar flare that had erupted from the sun's surface 8 minutes earlier, sending a wave of charged particles racing toward Earth at speeds that defied comprehension. The flare was massive, the kind that happens maybe once or twice in a solar cycle, and when it hit Earth's magnetosphere, it would cause a geomagnetic storm that would interfere with radio communications and satellite systems across the entire Pacific region. But none of that had happened yet, and on the Lincoln's bridge the mood was still routine, officers monitoring their stations while enlisted personnel carried out their assigned tasks with the mechanical efficiency of daily practice. Tyler was on duty in the Combat Information Center, monitoring the radar displays that showed the positions of the other ships in their battle group, watching the green blips move across the screen in their designated patterns. He found the work boring, if he was honest, just staring at screens and confirming that everything was where it was supposed to be, but he understood it was necessary, and he performed his duties with the diligence of someone who still cared about making a good impression. The first sign that something was wrong came at 60:47 hours, when one of the communications officers reported intermittent problems with the satellite uplink. It wasn't anything dramatic, just some packet loss and delayed responses, the kind of glitch that could happen for a dozen different reasons. Within minutes, though, the problems escalated, satellite feeds dropping out entirely before flickering back to life, and then the GPS system started showing errors, position readings jumping erratically, as the satellites they relied on lost their ability to maintain accurate timing. On the bridge, the commanding officer, Captain Sarah Chen, immediately ordered a switch to backup navigation systems, following protocols that had been drilled into her through years of training and experience. The backup systems came online smoothly, redundancy doing exactly what it was designed to do, but then those systems started failing too, the geomagnetic storm intensifying as Earth rotated into the full force of the solar wind. By 17:15 hours, every electronic navigation system on the USS Abraham Lincoln was either completely offline or providing data so corrupted it was worse than useless. The GPS showed them simultaneously in 3 different locations, hundreds of miles apart. The inertial navigation system, which should have been immune to external interference, had apparently been affected by the electromagnetic pulse that had accompanied the geomagnetic storm, its gyroscopes giving readings that drifted further from reality with each passing minute. Radio communication with the other ships in the battle group was spotty at best, brief moments of clarity followed by long stretches of static and silence. The storm that had been building on the horizon had arrived too, bringing with it winds that gusted to 40 knots and seas that rolled the massive carrier in ways that made even experienced sailors reach for handholds. Captain Chen stood at the center of the bridge, her calm exterior masking the calculation happening behind her eyes as she ran through options and contingencies. They had charts, traditional paper charts that showed the coastline and underwater hazards, but without knowing their exact position, those charts were just pretty pictures. They could make an educated guess based on their last known location and their approximate course and speed, but in these waters, educated guesses could put you on the rocks or into shipping lanes where massive container vessels traveled routes they couldn't deviate from. The other ships in the battle group were in similar situations, all of them suddenly blind in an ocean that had seemed so thoroughly mapped and understood just an hour before. Down in the Combat Information Center, Tyler sat at his dead console staring at the blank screens with a growing sense of dread that he couldn't quite name. Around him, other sailors were working through paper backup procedures, pulling out manuals that nobody had actually used in years, their confidence eroding as they realized how dependent they'd become on systems that now didn't work. Morrison caught Tyler's eye across the room and shook his head, his earlier cockiness replaced by genuine concern. The ship's executive officer, Commander James Martinez, appeared in the CIC doorway, his face set in the kind of expression that meant decisions were being made above their pay grade. "Anyone here have experience with celestial navigation?" he asked, his voice cutting through the low buzz of worried conversation. The question was met with silence, 24 sailors looking at each other and finding the same lack of knowledge reflected back. Tyler felt his stomach drop because he suddenly understood what Hayes had been trying to tell them in the mess hall, that there were skills that couldn't be replaced by technology, knowledge that seemed obsolete right up until the moment you desperately needed it. Commander Martinez's jaw tightened, and he pulled out his radio. "Get me Hayes," he said. "Walter Hayes, the contractor. Someone find him and get him to the bridge immediately." Hayes arrived on the bridge 12 minutes later, still wearing his faded coveralls and carrying the leather satchel that Tyler had mocked just days before. He took in the situation with a single sweeping glance, reading the tension in the officers' postures and the dead navigation screens, like someone reading a familiar book. Captain Chen turned to face him, and there was no ceremony in her voice, just direct need. "Hayes, Commander Martinez tells me you know celestial navigation. We need a position fix, and we need it now." Hayes nodded, already moving to the chart table and spreading out one of the paper charts with practiced hands. "What was your last confirmed GPS position, and what time?" he asked, his voice taking on a tone of command that made several of the younger officers straighten unconsciously. Chen rattled off coordinates and a timestamp from 45 minutes prior, and Hayes marked the position on the chart with a pencil, course and speed since then. Another exchange of information, Hayes making quick calculations in his head and marking their dead reckoning position, the estimated location based on where they'd been and how they'd been moving. But dead reckoning accumulated errors quickly, especially in heavy seas where currents and wind could push a ship off course in ways that were hard to account for, and Hayes knew they needed something more accurate. He glanced at the clock, then at the western sky where the sun was dropping toward the horizon through breaks in the storm clouds. "I need to shoot the sun," he said, pulling the sextant from his satchel and checking its adjustment. "And I need someone who can do math to help me with the calculations." Tyler found himself standing without consciously deciding to do it, moving toward the chart table as if pulled by strings. Hayes looked at him, recognition flickering in those pale blue eyes, but there was no judgment in his expression, just assessment. "You any good with numbers, son?" Hayes asked. Tyler nodded, his throat tight. "Engineering major before I enlisted. I can handle math." "Good. You're going to be my assistant then." Hayes led them out onto the bridge wing where the wind immediately tried to tear them off the deck and the spray from the waves below stung their faces with salt. He braced himself against the railing, bringing the sextant up to his eye and making minute adjustments as he sighted the sun through the clouds. It took several attempts, waiting for moments when the sun was visible and the horizon line clear enough to measure against, but finally Hayes got his reading and called out the angle. Tyler wrote it down in the notebook. Hayes handed him, his hands shaking from adrenaline and the cold wind. Back inside, Hayes worked through the calculations, his movements sure, despite decades away from active navigation. He consulted the worn tables in his notebook, making corrections for time and position, cross-referencing multiple sources to verify his. The process took nearly an hour, Hayes working methodically through each step while Tyler assisted with calculations, and Captain Chen watched with the kind of focus that comes from understanding that lives depend on accuracy. Other officers came and went, bringing updates on the ship's systems and the worsening weather, but Hayes remained centered on his task, occasionally asking for fresh measurements or double-checking a calculation. Finally, he straightened from the chart table, his finger marking a point on the map that was 12 miles northwest of their dead reckoning position. "We're here," he said with quiet certainty. "The current's been pushing us west stronger than your systems accounted for, and the wind's been adding a northward component." Captain Chen studied the position, comparing it to the hazard markers on the chart, and felt relief wash over her because Hayes's fix put them in safe water with clear routes back to base. "You're sure about this?" she asked, because in the end she was responsible for everyone on this ship, and certainty mattered more than ego. Hayes met her gaze steadily. "I've been navigating these waters since before you were born, Captain. I'm sure." Chen nodded once, then turned to her bridge crew. "Set course for home based on this position. Communications. Keep trying to raise the other ships and pass along our navigation method. Maybe we can help them get home too." The journey back to Naval Base Kitsap took 14 hours, the Lincoln proceeding at reduced speed through the storm while Hayes remained on the bridge, taking regular celestial shots whenever the clouds broke enough to allow them. Each new position fix confirmed his initial calculation, showing them making steady progress towards safe harbor, while the geomagnetic storm continued to wreak havoc with electronic systems across the Pacific. Tyler stayed with him through the entire voyage, learning the process of celestial navigation in the most intense crash course imaginable, his hands growing steady with the sextant and his mind grasping the mathematical relationships between angles and positions. Hayes taught without condescension, explaining each step and the reasoning behind it, sharing knowledge that he'd thought might die with his generation. Around them, the bridge crew adapted to this older way of operating, officers calling out visual references and keeping track of time with mechanical chronometers, everyone functioning as an integrated system the way navies had for centuries before satellites and GPS. The USS Abraham Lincoln passed under the Hood Canal Bridge at 0630 hours, the rising sun painting the water gold, and the storm finally spent behind them. On the bridge wing, Tyler stood next to Hayes, watching the familiar landmarks of Puget Sound come into focus, and he felt something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what it meant to be a sailor. The past 14 hours had stripped away his arrogance, replacing it with a hard-won respect for the knowledge that experience provides, and the humility that comes from realizing how little you actually know. Hayes hadn't said much during the final approach, just made his measurements and calculations with the same steady competence he'd shown throughout the crisis. But now, as the ship slowed for its approach to the pier, he turned to Tyler. "You did good work last night," he said simply. Tyler shook his head, emotion tightening his throat. "I'm sorry for what I said in the mess hall, for how I acted. You were trying to warn us and I was too stupid to listen." Hayes smiled, and it was gentle in a way that made Tyler's chest ache. "You weren't stupid, son. You were young. There's a difference. Young people are supposed to believe in the new ways, supposed to push forward and embrace change. That's how progress happens. But progress doesn't mean forgetting everything that came before, and that's what I was trying to tell you." The pier was close now, deck crews preparing to receive the mooring lines, and Tyler could see other carriers that had made it back during the night, their own journeys home probably involving similar improvisations and rediscovered skills. The geomagnetic storm had been headline news apparently, satellite networks across the globe disrupted, airlines grounded, communications chaos that would take days to fully sort out. But the USS Abraham Lincoln and her crew had made it home safely, because one old man had refused to let ancient knowledge die. Captain Chen appeared beside them, her exhaustion visible now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Hayes, I'm putting you in for a commendation," she said. "What you did last night saved this ship." Hayes shook his head. "Just did my job, Captain. Same as everyone else." But Chen wasn't having it. "No, what you did was remind us that technology is a tool, not a replacement for skill and knowledge. We got complacent, all of us, and that almost cost us. I'm instituting mandatory celestial navigation training for all bridge officers and quartermasters, and I want you to be the instructor." Hayes looked surprised for the first time since Tyler had met him, then slowly nodded. "I'd be honored, Captain." As the ship secured to the pier and the crew began the process of shutdown and debriefing, Tyler helped Hayes gather his navigation tools, carefully wrapping the sextant in its cloth before placing it in the leather satchel. The instrument that had seemed like a relic now felt sacred, a connection to generations of sailors who'd gone to sea with nothing but skill and courage to guide them home. In the days and weeks that followed, Tyler became Hayes's first student in the new navigation program, learning not just the mechanics of celestial navigation, but the philosophy behind it. The understanding that redundancy meant more than backup electronics, it meant backup knowledge, backup skills, and backup wisdom passed down through the ages. The crew never laughed at Hayes's tools again. Tyler never forgot the lesson he'd learned that night in the storm, that sometimes the old ways survive not because people are stuck in the past, but because those ways contain truths that no amount of progress can render obsolete. And the sea always remembers what happens when humans forget to respect